This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Are you finding it harder than ever before to survive disruptions that threaten your current way of life? What we are experiencing is what I would call a disruptive shock. So what is a disruptive shock? It is a sudden, upsetting, or surprising event or experience that stops something from continuing as usual. And that is what we call our day-to-day life that has been disrupted. COVID-19 is the poster child for a disruptive shock. With the growing impact from COVID-19, I was getting an increasing number of calls from leaders asking for advice, given the unknowns of what we are facing. And rather than just share with a few leaders, I wanted to make what I was sharing broadly available to others. So I recently hosted a free webinar where I shared my experiences with previous disruptive shocks, such as the SARS disruption of supply chain in China, the Fukushima tsunami, that yet another unexpected disruption to the global supply chain for consumer electronics, my work with the White House on Katrina and recovery of Katrina, and my work with foreign governments on economic and society recoveries. Face it, leaders are finding it harder than ever before to survive disruptions that threaten their current way of life. But is just surviving enough? The ability to identify, survive, and then actually leverage the right current and emerging disruptions, including COVID-19, at the right time is the new must-have skill set that all leaders need in their arsenal. Today's show is an excerpt from the recent webinar. And at the end of today's show, I will share how you can attend the Disruptive Shock series via Zoom and get your questions answered. The webinar series is free. Here is Disruptive Shock. This webinar got put together because I was starting to receive a number of phone calls from CEOs and government officials around what we are all facing with the COVID-19 experience around the world. And how do you plan for that, both from an economic standpoint, but also as leaders within our individual organizations? How do we think about and how do you strategize when we're dealing with something that is just so surprising, unexpected, and not something that you would put into your normal planning cycle? So we're going to spend about 30 minutes, as Mark said. I'm going to share with you some thoughts, my past experiences of having had to innovate my way through disruptive shocks and other categories, give you some of my lessons learned, things that I would advise or coach leaders on how do you need to think about this and how do you strategize around it, but also more importantly, how to lead your teams and your organizations through the overall disruptive shock. So let's get started. So what do I mean by disruption? We talk about disruptive innovation. Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School kind of cornered that term on disruptive innovation, innovations that totally disrupt industries that already exist. If you've written or have read Clayton's book, then you would, the stories in there talk about hard drives and small hard drives being able to disrupt the big hard drive manufacturers, and, new entrants being able to overtake existing. Today's world, you could argue that Uber and Lyft fit into that category and totally disrupting taxi cab companies and limousine companies and those kinds of things. So disruption, I think we all kind of get a good handle on. It's really kind of an interruption to the normal path, the normal activities, the way things always were. And there's always happening. It's happening in the form of new technologies, new entrants, new business models, etc. And some of the business ones that we use as some of these examples would be, Blockbuster being disrupted by Netflix, Nokia being disrupted with the smartphone business, Kodak in digital photography. Now, what's interesting in all three of these is all three of these companies were actually the first ones in their market segment to go off and experiment. So Blockbuster, for instance, tried to do digital distribution of video long before Netflix ever existed. And so why did that work, or why didn't that work? Well, one reason is, and if you are a follower and listen to the podcast or my radio show, the phrasing I always remind people of is the difference between a good idea and a great idea is rarely the idea. It is about the timing and how do you think about the timing. So in the case of Blockbuster, they were way ahead. Broadband networks into homes were not broadly available. The fastest speeds were ISDN, just weren't able to support it. And then Blockbuster wrote it off saying, oh, that's never going to work. We tried it. We did that experiment and set it to the side. Nokia, same thing. They came out with the Nokia Navigator, which was the very first, or one of the very first smartphones, long before the iPhone. It was big. The battery life wasn't all that great. There really wasn't wireless data services yet. And again, Nokia said, look, we tried, it didn't work. There's no market for this. Threw it to the side and just kept on their current path. Kodak came out with one of the very first digital cameras. That digital camera, I think it was like a 1 megapixel or slightly less than 1 megapixel camera. The quality wasn't all that good. When you printed out the image, it looked really bad. Kodak again said, oh, nobody's going to ever want that. Digital photography is not where the future is. All three of these companies fell into the same trap. That trap is the fact that you already are biased towards your existing business model. People will go off and try something new, and they look for something that reaffirms their bias. The bias is look, we're the leader, Blockbuster, we're the leader, Nokia, we're the big guys, and Kodak, look, we've been around for 100 years. Nobody's going to disrupt Kodak. That's a bias. And so when they go off and they do these experiments, and for those of you who run innovation teams inside particularly large organizations, like I did at HP, to Hewlett Packard, you're fighting against the innovation antibodies that are saying, see, you tried it, it's not as good, it's never going to work. That is the premise of what Clayton wrote about around disruptive innovation. It is this antibody response, and this will always happen. This is what happens going forward. The taxi cab companies even looking at the outsiders like Uber and Lyft saying, oh, nobody's going to want to order a taxi cab. People are going to want to stand on the curb and raise their hand. It's all part of the way cabs have been doing this for 50 years. And now look what happened. So these are kind of the normal disruptions that we are all very familiar with. Now, there are actually three types of disruption. One is operational disruption. This is just kind of the normal fluctuation of your pricing and et cetera. You could have things like supply chain disruption, like a certain material that you need in it just becomes short of supply, or your demand goes up and you can't meet it, or your competition bought all that supply in the marketplace. Or price wars. I can tell you all kinds of stories of my years at HP around price wars in the laptop business and the desktop business, and everybody's trying to squeak out their 3 or 4% operating profit. Those are just kind of normal operational disruptions. And you can plan around those. You do sensitivity analysis to say, so what happens if we had a delay in certain components? What would be the strategy? Or what happens if competitor A drops their price 5%? What would be our response? And you can run through all kinds of scenario planning to just kind of think through what your reaction would be should that disruption occur. Now, competitive disruption, this is really attempts to create a major shift, a superior position, some advantage over the competitors. Uber being and Lyft being perfect examples. It wasn't somebody, they already had an established business and they are trying to improve themselves. They're the outsider coming in. They're going to try to disrupt an entire industry and totally blow it up. Tesla with electronic vehicles, and there's lots of examples of the new entrants. You could argue Google is that way. Google was not the first browser. They came in and they created a competitive disruption to the existing browser world, with Netscape, being the leader at that time. We will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back as we continue listening to an excerpt from the Disruptive Shock webinar. Remember, at the end of today's show, I will share how you can attend the Disruptive Shock series via Zoom and get your questions answered. The series is free. Here is Disruptive Shock. And then the third category, Disruptive Shocks. Disruptive shocks are those disruptions that you just cannot anticipate. They're highly unpredictable. They're unexpected. You don't get, in many cases, much lead time to say that they're going to happen tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, or a year from now. COVID-19. It's not like you could, plan for COVID-19 or even anticipate what that impact would be. But people have been playing up the Bill Gates video. Bill made a presentation at I think it was a 2015 TED conference. I was there, talking about pandemics and how ill-prepared the world is for pandemics. And now people are pulling out that 2015 video and saying, see, we should have, we knew it was coming. No, you kind of know something could happen, particularly when you got Ebola and SARS and kind of early weak signals of things going on. But, I don't think anybody can stand up and claim that they predicted that COVID-19 was going to happen before it happened. Now, natural disasters. Well, you kind of know a hurricane is going to happen somewhere in the world. You don't know when is a hurricane going to hit a specific, location like New Orleans with Katrina. You just know it's going to happen. So you can do a little bit, but you don't know where, and you don't know how to plan for those kinds of things. So now, in today's webinar, we're not going to have enough time to cover all of these. We are just going to focus on disruptive shocks today. That's what I'm going to talk about. Share with you my background and my experience, some of the disruptive shocks I've had to engage on and deal with, given my different roles, my lessons learned, and also the scars you get from going through these things. And hopefully you find them useful no matter what your industry is, size of organization, or whether you're even a multinational, a small business, an NGO, or a government official. This is just what I've gone through in my career, where I've had to deal with these disruptive shocks. And how do you innovate your way out of it? Don't become a victim to it, but how do you not only survive, but are there ways to thrive through these disruptive shocks? So what do I mean by disruptive shock? It's a sudden, upsetting, it's you're totally caught off guard, surprising event that stops something from continuing as usual. Now, these are some disruptive shocks that we all are pretty familiar with, whether it be flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes. I spent a good chunk of my career in Silicon Valley. We always got the annual earthquake push from the government to be able to survive 72 hours should an earthquake hit in Northern California. And then the fires, and we saw the fires that happened in California from the electrical fires generated by electric utility companies. All of these are disruptive shocks that we all have to deal with. Now, some of these can be fairly short-lived. You might have a tornado, and it may impact a fairly small part of a town or an area, whatever, but the rest of the country is fine. Same thing with flooding, same thing with earthquakes, same thing with fires such as Northern California. Those of us that do not live there, we can sit there and go, wow, that's really bad. They've must be really tough. How are they going to rebuild their houses? But the rest of us, not impacted. COVID-19 is unique. It is impact on a global basis, on a global scale. If you look, for instance, just at the economic prediction for the impact in the US, and I've done this analysis, I've looked at about 14 leading analyst firms to look at GDP impact from COVID-19. They're predicting that GDP for this year will be down anywhere from 11 to 30%. Just to put that in context, the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, over a 3-year period, GDP was down 20%, right? So this gets into how do you deal with this? Now, what's interesting is a lot of people don't think about it. If you think about the Depression, you try to compare what's going to happen. I don't think it's going to be that bad. But as business leaders, if you're in the business world, same thing if you're a government official, the way to think about that is there's a general rule. In a depression or a recession, do not start a business. That's kind of the general rule. Do you know how many businesses were started in the Depression that now are some of our leading companies? Disney is one example. HP is another example. Hewlett and David Packard started HP, in some of the worst downturn in the marketplace, right? So we cannot cower. We cannot retreat. We need to be and play that leadership role in identifying those opportunities, not only to react so that we can have something on the other side, but then positioning ourselves to take advantage of the opportunities to really thrive and create opportunities for ourselves. Don't wait and expect for others to create opportunities for us. So let me talk a little bit about my disruptive shock experience in history. So SARS, for those of you, may have been around with SARS, I was at HP, and for us, SARS had a pretty significant impact, not from the standpoint of anybody being, the population issues in the US, but in China, it was pretty significant to the supply chain. Supply chain was not as digitally managed or monitored, and it was quite disruptive when you are a multinational trying to distribute product. And what was interesting out of SARS was to come up with an approach that said, something, we will never find ourselves in this situation again. We will not be single sourced on any key component. We cannot allow that to happen. That allows us to build what I call flexibility and resilience. 2 elements critical for any disruptive shock recovery is that ability to be that resiliency, that ability to have that flexibility built into the way your business operates. Now, I will tell you, we thought I had it all figured out in SARS, and then the Fukushima tsunami happened. Now you're thinking, okay, the tsunami happened, a lot of people were killed, we had the nuclear power plant issues, all those things. And at HP, we were dual sourced on everything, right? So we never had a single supplier for any component. Well, one of the key components at that time in laptops was DVD Blu-ray players, back when DVD Blu-ray players were still built into laptops. However, what we did not test and validate was the second order supply chain. So the component supplier supplying the manufacturer of the DVD and Blu-ray player that then supplied it to us that went into the laptop. It was the second order supply chain. We will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back as we continue listening to an excerpt from the Disruptive Shock webinar. Remember, at the end of today's show, I will share how you can attend the Disruptive Shock series via Zoom and get your questions answered. The series is free. Here is Disruptive Shock. In the case of the Fukushima tsunami, well, everybody in the industry, it wasn't just us, but every laptop manufacturer ran into this problem. The problem is that while we all were multi-sourced on DVD Blu-ray players from Sony and Toshiba and whoever, all of those suppliers got one component from one manufacturer. That one component is the little bitty spring that pops open the door and slides out the tray. Yes, that little bitty spring. Turns out that little bitty spring was made by one manufacturer, and that manufacturer was up by where the Fukushima tsunami happened. You could not get the spring. So one little spring shut down laptop supply for like 3 months. It was, when someone explained to me that we were held up, we couldn't ship, we were going to miss revenue targets because of a spring, it kind of wakes you up. So what I learned in that case was second order supply chain. Just because you dual supply from two suppliers for processor chips and memory or manufacturing parts or packaging or whatever is unique to what it is you're doing, second order supply chain. Think about that. When I was also at HP, right at the time I was taking over in the CTO role at HP, Katrina happened. And the White House worked it out for HP for me to be released by HP to head up the effort in New Orleans for the recovery of Katrina around technology and broadband infrastructure. So basically, I slept in a sleeping bag in the back of a in the floor of a tractor trailer in New Orleans because you couldn't sleep on the ground because the ground was contaminated to build up that infrastructure, right? Problem is that while New Orleans was wiped out, you literally had nothing there that you could take advantage of. Everything that you were going to do had to be shipped in. Now, fortunately, the rest of the country was fine. So a friend of mine, Vanu Bose in Boston, made arrangements to get me satellite services. FedEx made arrangements to give me a jet to fly in 3-meter dishes so we could take advantage of satellite to provide broadband services. I had HP and Dell and Gateway was still around at that time. They were shipping me laptops and all that so we could provide online access. So people coming back into New Orleans when it restarted. What I learned in Katrina was competition goes away. Politics goes away. The ability to leverage collaboration and cooperation during these most desperate times can be the difference between survival or long-term effect. And in the case of Katrina, the fact that people didn't care about the politics, people were willing to take a phone call and do whatever was in their power to allow for that recovery was, absolutely awe-inspiring. And I think we're seeing it today. We're seeing some great stories online about communities and neighbors and people helping out, right? But it's a lesson learned of don't think you got to do it yourself, and you cannot do it yourself. It is about collaborating and cooperation. And if you want to collaborate and cooperate, in many cases, that means you may need to collaborate and cooperate with people who you thought were a competitor, somebody that you would never sit across the table from, somebody that you would never reach out and ask for help. Be willing to reach out across the table. There's a great HP story. Back in the early days of HP, one of HP's biggest competitors had a huge manufacturing warehouse fire. They lost 100% of their inventory, and this was HP's arch enemy. A lot of companies would have said, great, we got a bigger market we can take over. Bill and Dave reached out to the CEO, and they actually made buildings and facilities available in Palo Alto to allow an HP competitor to get back up on its feet to compete against HP, which I think is absolutely just shocking, right? But that played back in spades later when HP needed help because of building that relationship. Collaboration, cooperation, absolutely critical. And then I've done some work with foreign governments, certain governments that have had genocides, that have had total economic collapse. And how do you go in there and think about economic and society recovery? And again, it is leveraging that collaboration and cooperation, but you've also got to fundamentally change some foundational pieces. You've got to think about how do you lay a foundation that allows you to get through the turmoil, but a foundation that you can build upon once you get to the other side. It isn't just about rushing through the fire and getting out the other side. It's how do you lay that foundation to get you to the other side, but that's a foundation that you can build on. I'm a CEO of Cable Labs. If you're not familiar with Cable Labs, press refers to us as the Bell Labs of the cable industry. We are funded by the largest cable operators in the world. So if you are enjoying and benefiting from your broadband connection from your cable operator, whether it's in the US, Europe, Asia, Latin and South America, if it's coming from a cable operator like Comcast here, or Virgin Media in the UK, or JCOM in Japan, or Liberty Latin America in the Caribbean, you're using a technology that was invented at Cable Labs. So we at Cable Labs in the cable industry, we take very seriously making sure those networks are up, right? So we actually got ahead of a little bit on the COVID-19 by actually sequestering our office buildings long before any government started doing shelter in places. And I'll talk a little bit about how we came to that strategy specifically around COVID-19, because it lays into a little bit of, as leaders, how are you going to get ahead? So what are these lessons learned? I'm going to try to summarize this into a set of lessons learned when I take a look at all of my disruptive shocks and how I responded to them. Number one, be decisive, take action. This is not a time to be saying, well, we'll wait till, next week and we'll think about it again, or let's wait till next week's senior staff meeting. You need to take action. You need to be decisive. You need to be willing to take an action and then course correct, right, as you learn more. But waiting till you get perfect information, and you could point to situations around the world right now with COVID-19 where people have been waiting to get better information before they make a decision, and that's going to show. The other is prioritize possible changes. What changes are you going to be impacted with? How do you prioritize all the things that are going to be disrupting against you? Number three, rapid high velocity experimentation. I think of this as one of the outputs of COVID-19 is it's a big social experiment. We don't know what life is going to be like on their side. Do people go back to, we immediately, Friday night, everybody says, oh, it's over. And Monday, everybody's back on the road and everybody's fighting traffic. I don't think so. So I think wherever your business model is or whoever you serve as your constituencies, you need to be ready to do a series of rapid, high-velocity experimentation, even now, not waiting until the magic answer is we're back to normal, is to do experimentation now to find your new normal and moving forward. And taking all of this, your actions, your prioritization, your experimentation, and adjust. Something's working out and you're getting some traction, adopt it. But keep thinking about what decisive actions do I need to take? What are my priorities? What's the priorities of my impact? What is that experimentation that I could do to get out ahead of this and to see where my new normal is going to be? And then constantly be willing to adjust and adopt. Now, how do I think about prioritization? This is a chart that I use all the time. The text on here being sales, revenue, supply chain, that's just purely examples. You can put anything you want on it. But this is basically what we refer to as a 2x2 impact analysis. So what I'm doing is I'm writing down a series of things that are happening, right? So you could say supply chain could be impacted, cyber attack, what would that do to your industry or business? You could have government regulations change or flip overnight. And how would that impact your business? You could have a hurricane or you can have a pandemic. We will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back as we continue listening to an excerpt from the Disruptive Shock webinar. Remember, at the end of today's show, I will share how you can attend the Disruptive Shock series via Zoom and get your questions answered. The series is free. Here is Disruptive Shock. Down the right-hand side on that angle then is the list of everything else that are the same thing. So now you're trying to do a 2x2. So you're looking at, if I have a pandemic down across the bottom and I look at that far left box, that's sales and revenue. Well, that's obviously negative. How negative is it going to be? And what would be your way to flip it? How do you turn it from a negative to a positive? What would you do? Is there something about your product or service that the pandemic actually turns it into a positive? So, for instance, we're sitting here using Zoom. Zoom has been a sponsor of my radio show for more than 5 years now. Eric Ewing, who's the CEO for Zoom, is a friend. I've known him when he was at Cisco. He's one of the original developers of WebEx before he left to start Zoom, right? Talk about being in the right place with the best tool. Think about Zoom in the result of the pandemic. Do you have something similar? Do you have something that you can leverage? Not by, faking it. Do you really have something? Can you position what you're doing to be helpful? In the case of Eric, yes, he's got the best tool, but what did he do? He's giving it away. It's not about the revenue. It is about positioning a foundation, as I said before, a foundation that you can build upon in order to have something to build upon when you get to the other side. So part of the creative effort is what's your list down the left, what's your list down the right, and then look at those comparisons. And when you see a big negative, like hurricane and supply chain, could be big, cyber attack to regulatory. If you had a cyber attack, government might step in and put regulation on you, particularly if you're in banking or stock exchange or other areas, right? Whatever those things that could be impacted, and this is not limited. We've done 2x2 charts that are 30 or 40 items on big poster board, looking at all the possible combinations. And when we find a big negative, we focus in on looking at the big negative, like pandemic impact to sales. And we look at that negative, and our task then is to innovate. How do I make that a positive? What if the opposite were true? How do I make the opposite true? Don't wait until you get to the other end. Start thinking about this now, because that's what allows you to build the foundation. The other way I think about it is I like to ask what I call disruptive questions, right? When you're in the middle of this, and look, what I like to do is to step back and ask myself a set of questions. So for instance, you could ask yourself somebody that you really respect, who you think is really innovative and creative, what would they do? So what would Elon Musk do? What would Einstein do? What would Thomas Edison do in this situation? Because it kind of gets you out of your head, and you're not thinking about what your reaction is. You're projecting, knowing what you know about potentially maybe an innovation idol of yours. What would they do in this situation? Number two, what's the one thing we absolutely should not do in this situation, right? Because that tells you kind of where your guardrails are. What's the line you will not cross? That becomes kind of your backstop. And number three, what would happen if we stopped doing or asked others to stop doing the following or something, right? So what if we asked people to stop, doing X? What would be that impact? And you go through, and it causes you to kind of think about it in a different way versus, I got to figure out a way to survive. I got to figure out to make money. Take a step back and get out of your own head and think about it in a whole different light. So, in summary, first of all, focus on leadership, not about getting census. This is not a time to be thinking about consensus. Focus on leadership. Two, get input from everyone within reason, not the person screaming and yelling at you, or and maybe not even your biggest customer. Get input from everybody. Be a sponge about getting that information. You know, for me in the early days, because we at Cable Labs, we actually have 7 of the largest cable operators in China are members and fund the work at Cable Labs, in addition to Comcast and Charter, Rogers and Shaw in Canada, Virgin Media in the UK, etc. Right? So we had that benefit of getting and pulsing information coming out of China. To have that is yet another input. Get input from everybody. Number 3, be optimistic. Look, we will get to the other side. We will recover. Create your plan. Be optimistic, but have a plan B. Right? Don't be Pollyannish. Be optimistic, but have a plan B. Number 4, be prepared for the rebound. Right? When you look at organizations that had the biggest uptick post some disruptive shock, like a hurricane in an area, or an earthquake, or a pandemic, those that had the biggest success on the other end was they prepared for the rebound. What you just heard was an excerpt of the Disruptive Shock webinar. Now, why did I host this free webinar? In these times of uncertainty, I felt that by sharing my experiences with disruptive shocks, other leaders could have one more set of inputs as they try to navigate the changes that are coming. The ability to identify, survive, and then actually leverage the right current and emerging disruptions at the right time is the new must-have skill set that all leaders need in their arsenal. Now, who should attend the webinar series? This webinar applies to all types of organizations, ranging from small businesses to large multinational enterprises, nonprofits, NGOs, and governments. You can register to be part of the series on Disruptive Shock by visiting disruptiveshock.com. You'll receive a link to the Zoom webinar to join in on the conversation and to get your questions answered. Again, to register, visit disruptiveshock.com. Thanks for taking the time in your schedule to be part of today's show. I would love to hear your feedback. Drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. And until next week, stay safe.